biblically, faith and wisdom are partners, not rivals. And they complement each other so well, but are actually completely useless when you separate them. So, Proverbs 3 tells us to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not in your own understanding.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Lightwell Podcast. So glad to have you with us wherever you are and however you are joining us today. On this podcast, we typically talk a lot about insurance. We talk about risk management and finding the right insurance product for your particular needs. And we'll talk some about that today, but generally, we're going to sidestep that and have a conversation really more about the relationship between faith and risk. And to do that, we've got the Lightwell Insurance Advisor, Director of National Operations and Network Collaboration. His name is Matt Gumbert, and this isn't his first job. In fact, before working for Lightwell Insurance Advisors, his background is in vocational ministry. So he brings a very good and well-rounded background to the conversation. It's very interesting and hopefully very helpful to you. So let's get right into our conversation with Matt Gumbert. Well, it is my pleasure to be joined by my friend Matt Gumbert. Prepare yourself. This is a mouthful, but he is the Lightwell Insurance Advisors National Director of Operations and Network Collaboration. Did I get it right?
You did. Congratulations. Yeah, that's impressive. I don't even get it right half the time.
Matt's business card is actually a scroll, and when he hands it out, he has to go like this and show a lot of extra words to people.
It feels really cool, though, when I pull that out of my pocket and, scroll it out. I feel so important.
But prior to being all of that for Lightwell Insurance Advisors, Matt has served on staff with a couple of church plants. So he's been in vocational ministry, and now he's working vocationally in insurance, serving ministry. And so his unique background and perspective is why we're going to talk about what we're talking about today, which is the relationship between faith and risk. This is a sidestep from our normal kind of content where we usually talk about risk management topics or insurance considerations for churches. But today we're going to dive more into a topic about the philosophy of ministry and its relationship to risk and insurance. And so, Matt, thank you for your brain and your heart when it comes to that. And let's just lay the groundwork a little bit. How do you view generally that relationship, faith and risk?
Faith and risk are two things that feel like, right, they can just be in tension all the time. And I think that's appropriate because, when there's risk, there obviously is the potential of something going wrong or something really going south really fast. And so, when you have faith, there's a natural optimism that comes around with faith that tries to kind of supersede risk or eliminate risk. And while that's okay to think about it that way, I don't know that that's always the best way to think about it. Because inherently, right, Hebrews talks about faith is being sure of that which we cannot see, right? So if you can't actually see it, there's risk in that you're not actually seeing what the faith is leading you into or commanding you to think about or do. And so, the two, again, there's this tension there, but I think they can actually be married really well. And I'm excited that we can talk about that a little bit more today.
This is deep water, and it can kind of bring up some worry for a ministry leader to say, what's the appropriate amount of just stepping out in faith versus taking the appropriate steps to keep people protected, to keep people safe. And so, from a biblical perspective, how does wisdom and faith operate together rather than, like you said before, kind of being seen as opposites? How do you find that balance of wisdom in the middle of faith and risk?
I want to backtrack actually just for a second about that risk piece. And it feels like today, ministry is riskier than it was, maybe 20, 30 years ago. And I don't think that that's necessarily the case. But I do think what we're seeing is an inundation, for ministry leaders of negative stories, worst case scenarios, these cautionary tales. And that's not imagined. Ministries, I think, are just seeing them more often like more loudly, largely to social media and without context. So sidetrack, right? I really like studies, right? I'm a little bit of a nerd when it comes to information. So sorry, you're going to get some information overload today. There was actually this really interesting, as I was kind of reading up on this, Stanford back study that looked at news stories, 30 million news stories from 2010 to 2020. And they looked at news, social media posts, and they found that most major news outlets actually post twice as much negative content as possible.
Wow.
For every one positive story, there are two negative stories, right? And that's continued to go up and up and up and up. And there's been some other studies that has shown that already. And I think that there can sometimes then be a hesitation as a ministry leader seeing that, because you feel responsible for your protecting your people and your resources and even the reputation of the church. And so that can create this, like I said, this tension between faith and risk that we're talking about, right? And so, a leader doesn't want to be the one that like ruins the ministry. And so how do you actually approach that with wisdom? That's the kind of the question at hand here, right? Biblically, faith and wisdom are partners, not rivals, and they complement each other so well, but are actually completely useless when you separate them. So, Proverbs 3 tells us to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not in your own understanding, and that tackles faith and wisdom. The faith is trusting in God. The wisdom is leaning not on your own understanding. And I think actually Jesus demonstrates this really well in his tempting in the wilderness. Right, so he has all the faith in the world. I mean, he's Jesus, right? The literal God in flesh. All the faith in the world to fulfill the temptations that are put before him. None of which are inherently bad or evil things, by the way. Hey, here's some food because you're hungry. Don't hurt yourself, and rule over the kingdom that is already yours. Right? That's the temptations. But he had the wisdom to know that while those things were and are a part of God's plan for him, that this isn't the right time, right? That this isn't when God had it happening. So faith is trusting that God's character, promises, and guidance and wisdom are true, and then applying God's truth to real situations. I heard someone say once that faith gives wisdom its foundation, and wisdom gives faith its shape, which is really powerful. Faith is ultimately that foundation, but wisdom helps us to see how that actually plays out IRL, right, in real life. And that is such a great partnership when you have those two together. If you're lacking either one, not only does the scripture tell us to ask for it, but you're woefully missing the point of either one without the other.
Man, oh man, there is so much in that answer, Matt. That was fantastic. Thank you for all the ground you covered there. Now, I do want to key in on something that we have talked about extensively as it relates primarily to finances, but it's the idea of stewardship. So, we've talked about that a lot on this podcast, namely, kind of expanding the definition of or redefining at some level stewardship to mean not just the saving of money, but making sure that whatever money you use appropriately covers the needs that you actually have. That's good stewardship. Making sure that you are spending the right amount of money to cover exactly what it is your ministry does, or its passion areas that also have insurance risks to them. So, I mean, you can speak on this, or maybe I've already answered my own question, but I would contend that good stewardship actually gives a ministry the chance to be more bold, because you know that you've taken care of the things you need to take care of to take steps in outreach or in faith or doing the things that you feel called to do. What do you think about that?
100%. Yeah. I mean, stewardship, and you already touched on it, is all about using God's resources in a God honoring and responsible way. Right. And the more important of those two is the God honoring part, because there are some times when, in our limited understanding, it feels that whatever God is asking us to do is like the least responsible thing we could possibly be doing. Okay. And that's okay. But that's where faith steps in and allows the space for ministry to trust God. Faith is trusting God with the outcomes of whatever it is that we're stepping into. So good stewardship removes avoidable fear and vulnerability. It doesn't diminish your faith in any way. So, you talk about insurance, and insurance over the last several years. I mean, we have seen such an increase in severe weather patterns, litigation frequency. I mean, inflation. There's shrinking carrier capacity in some regards, and ignoring those realities really doesn't increase your faith. It just increases your vulnerability. We mentioned Proverbs earlier. Proverbs 22 again says that the prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and suffer for it. So when an organization knows that they have addressed foreseeable risks responsibly, right? Be it their property, their liability, any kind of abuse prevention, governance, whatever it is, right? You don't have to be consumed by or thinking about all of this preventable catastrophe that could be out there. So, wise stewardship really acknowledges the risk landscape and then takes steps to address it. That really doesn't replace trust in God. It just creates margin so that you can step into that a little bit more. The security that can bring then, as you mentioned, it can free leaders up, frankly, to pray bigger prayers and serve more boldly and focus more intently on what it is that God has called them to do in their communities.
I really love that. And to kind of point out the kind of negative flip side of that coin, what ideas, what passion areas, what callings might fall to the cutting room floor if you're so fearful of getting it wrong because you haven't stewarded on the front end to make sure that you've got, coverage or whatever for that passion, that area of calling or that risk that you want to take. If you're worried about it going poorly, you might never do it. And that's a sad reality. That's the flip side of what you were just talking
It
about.
is, yeah. I mean, you'll see programs, canceled. I mean, outreach might be trimmed back. Your staff is probably operating under this like chronic stress because they're not sure about whether that thing maybe that they want to try or that they're feeling God is leading into, if that's going to be punished instead of encouraged. Innovation slows down, volunteers disengage. Leaders are becoming reactionary instead of visionary. They're second guessing every initiative. I mean, it can be paralyzing, like truly paralyzing. And when you're so focused on that, what that's actually doing is reshaping the culture of your organization. And those little subtle shifts where maybe once you kind of say, okay, well, instead of doing 100 outreach events, we're gonna trim it back to 90 this year because of XYZ. Or well, okay, now we're just gonna do 80. Or well, now we're gonna do like what that's doing is it can actually move the organization then from mission driven to maintenance focused. And that's not a good spot to be. It's not. And at the end of the day, the mission suffers, right? It's not because the mission or the gospel in any way is lacking power. People just feel paralyzed and like they can't act. And that is such it hurts my heart. It really does to see a church or a ministry in that space.
Well, I mean, let's turn our attention. You and I are talking to each other right now, but let's turn our attention to any ministry leader who might be listening to this and hearing what feels like maybe a theoretical conversation around faith and risk. And if you had a word to say to the ministry leader that's listening today who might be sitting there worried about getting it wrong and kind of playing that sort of protectionist defense rather than feeling emboldened to go out and do the calling to which they have been called, how would you encourage them today? What would you say to a ministry leader listening today about this?
I mean, first thing I say, if you're feeling that weight, kind of like that weight of responsibility, truly, first thing is well done. Like well done. I think there's this perception that if we feel the weight of something, like the weight of responsibility in something, that we don't have, especially as ministry leaders, right? We don't have adequate faith, or that we don't trust God enough for whatever reason. And I'm gonna be straight with you, like that is a lie from Satan himself. It really is. Look at Jesus in the garden before his arrest, right? The man was feeling the weight. He was feeling the weight. And responsibility feels heavy, right? Because it is heavy. And if you don't feel that, frankly, you need to ask God to search your heart. Okay. So if you are feeling that, and like, man, I don't know what to do. Like, well done. Now, what you can't do is let that paralyze you. Okay. Um, but that's where I think it's a great reminder for leaders that God is not asking you to predict the future. Remember, faith trusts God with outcomes. Okay, He doesn't ask you to predict the future. He just asks you to act faithfully and with wisdom in the present. Right. So as a leader, make sure you are, praying earnestly, seeking out expertise and wise counsel, and make the best decision that you absolutely can with integrity, and then trust God with the results.
Man, Matt, this is so good. I love what you're saying. Okay, continuing to address that ministry leader, oftentimes, because church staffs are frequently small, the person who is upfront doing the teaching is also the insurance decision maker, the person who has to steward all of those resources and make administrative calls and all that kind of stuff. So, not to over spiritualize what we do. It is insurance, and many companies who don't share that kind of Lightwell mission of wanting to serve ministry in particular can do a great job of protecting a church building. So it's not to over spiritualize the product itself, but what is your opinion on a biblical view of insurance for an insurance decision maker who's also a pastor? Someone who wants to operate biblically and do things the right way in everything that they're doing, including that insurance decision making.
Yeah, that's a tough one because insurance as we know it is not specifically addressed in Scripture. It's not like the religious leaders like hopped on their donkey and went down to their local office to talk to their Lightwell advisor and be like, "Hey, which policy is best for the temple?" And all its affiliated like that didn't happen. So decision makers in particular are having to rely on that balance of faith and wisdom that we talked about earlier, and that can be really really tough, especially since, as you mentioned, there is a dollar amount tied to having something like an insurance policy, and every dollar coming to your organization is one that you have been entrusted to steward well. So, spending those dollars on this means not spending those dollars on something else. So we mentioned Proverbs 3 earlier, and trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your understanding. That's verse 5. Well, verse 6 says, in all your ways, submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. So, at the end of the day, really a biblically centered view of insurance recognizes it, in my opinion, as a tool of stewardship. It's one of the tools that you can add to your tool belt. So, a leader is going to ensure the ministry because they value continuity and protection of God's work. They ensure, the sanctuary or the building, not because they're worshiping the building, but because they care about the people that live there or that gather there, excuse me. And so, I want to make sure that I'm doing all that I can as a leader to take care of all that God has entrusted to me, even if that means it feels like I'm losing right now. Um, I think of Joseph and the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. Okay, so like let's put ourselves in Joseph's shoe for a second and imagine like you're pitching this at your next board meeting or deacons meeting or whatever. It's like, all right, so hey guys, um, the president of our organization had this dream that 7 skinny cows ate 7 fat cows. So we need to start putting aside a portion of everyone's daily means of living to prepare for the day that some cows start to eat the other cows. Terrible pitch, right? Terrible. And we don't really get a whole lot of information on like how the Egyptians reacted or responded to this 7 year storage plan, but I can guarantee you that they were so incredibly grateful for it when the famine did come. So, thinking of insurance again as a tool of stewardship can reframe our thoughts on it from being this begrudging expense into an expression of care. Like I said earlier, I want to have all the best tool belts or tools in my tool belt that I can to protect the things that God has entrusted to me, even if those things haven't happened yet. And that's where you're leaning on His direction for you. Because I'm going to be totally honest with you, and this is an insurance podcast, so maybe this is like the wrong thing to say, but if you are feeling as a leadership team that the insurance that has been presented to you is not how God wants you to spend those funds, then don't do it. If God is not telling you to have that tool in your tool belt, don't do it. That again, that's that balance of faith and wisdom. Prepare and be prudent, but man, if God is telling you otherwise, you better listen.
That is so good, and it didn't scare me off. I think it's a great thing to say because I really do think at our best on the Lightwell podcast, what we are doing here is not a commercial for Lightwell Insurance Advisors across the country. We really are trying to resource and empower ministry leaders across the country to do what they think is absolutely in the best interest of their ministry, the calling to which they have been called, and to bless that regardless if they end up working with a Lightwell Insurance Advisor. So I absolutely love what you just said and agree.
I think I can speak on behalf of the entire Lightwell network in saying that, when you have those dollar pains, we feel that with you, seriously, deeply. I mean, when we're having conversations with ministries, they're like, That's gonna be how much? That premium is what? What is that deductible?" Man, we hurt with you because we want your mission to succeed, and we want you to be freed up to do all that God has called you to do in your community, and this thing can feel like such a barrier, and we feel that with you. So, hear the heart of Lightwell, and, like, it really is something that, we truly do believe that when your mission is protected, ours is fulfilled. But if that mission has no resources to run on, then, like, we have obviously an issue here. So we ultimately want the mission to be fulfilled.
That's so good. And not to turn that negative or to stoke fear, but the exact wrong day to find out that you don't have everything you need in your coverage is on the day of a claim. That's the wrong day to find out about whether or not your coverage that you've purchased does everything it needs to do for your ministry. And so, again, stopping short of this being a Lightwell Insurance Advisors commercial and stepping back more generally philosophically for a ministry leader, why would you say, as a part of all of this conversation, faith and risk, why would you say it's important to work with an insurance company, an insurance agency that not only just understands ministry, but feels called to serve ministries and not just provide an insurance product?
I mean, it might sound super super basic or like kind of duh, Matt, but it's because they understand ministry context. Like they get ministry, they get the church. Churches and nonprofits, they don't operate like for profit businesses or entities. And oftentimes you'll have mainstream insurers that can try to treat ministries, faith organizations strictly as this commercial entity, which can lead to gaps, exclusions, misunderstandings. I can recall one of our agencies actually trying to explain to some non-faith focused carriers the nuance of ministry operations, and their underwriters, the carrier team just was not getting it, to the point that ultimately they walked away and said, we're not interested because we don't understand the risk here. And that's no knock on them at all. They just don't live and breathe the church. A faith-based insurer recognizes volunteer-driven operations, unique governance structures, open door policies, these ministry-specific things, and it allows them to approach those with shared values and understanding, and not some kind of a suspicion or misunderstanding. So, having that alignment leads to better coverage, better advice, better partnership, which ultimately is what this is a partnership. And what a Lightwell advisor can do is really help to create confidence in that ministry that risk has been mitigated or addressed or at least thought through, and that confidence can fuel courage. So, when a team understands their exposures and they've taken reasonable steps to manage them, they're actually giving permission to themselves to say yes to that new opportunity. And leaders can stop asking, man, what could go wrong here? And actually start asking, how can God use this? And that's a really, really strong foundation to build off of.
That's so good. And it's such an interesting extension of what a pastor wants to do for their church anyway. I believe every person that's been called into leading a church wants to do right by their congregation, wants to lead well, to lead wisely. And yet, this is such a niche decision. It's a niche industry. And so you don't go to seminary and learn about biblically responsible insurance purchases. Maybe you should, but generally speaking, it's not a big part of that education. And so what I see, based on my limited view and what I get to experience from talking with our Lightwell insurance advisors, is that they see themselves as an extension of that pastor's mindset to take great care of that church. And you mentioned this is such a good point. When a commercial business buys insurance, they're thinking of management and staff as it regards the operations of that business. Churches don't run just on employees. They often are driven majority by volunteer work, and they have programs that meet off campus in someone's home, but it's a church sanctioned event. That would never happen if you were a shoe store or something like that. That's not how they work. And so if you purchase an off the shelf product from a well meaning commercial carrier, they're not going to think about things like volunteers or things that happen in the homes of congregants. That itself should feel like that comfort or that confidence that a pastor has someone in their corner asking questions they didn't even know how to didn't even know to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's so again, that is no knock on the mainstream carrier, right? Or the non, church or Christian nonprofit focused carrier. They just don't know what they don't know. So, it's the same thing that I say, on kind of the pastoral side. Like, well, if I know that somebody's not a believer, I'm not going to knock them for not acting like a believer, right? Why would they? That's silly to place that expectation on them because that's not the life they're trying to live. And it's the same thing with carriers. Like that is just not the niche. That's not the market that they're trying to serve. And so, why should we have that expectation? They know exactly how to ensure or address these risks. Well, we shouldn't. But you can have that expectation from someone or a carrier that proclaims to work in the faith market. Like, we insure churches, we insure Christian camps, schools, other, non-for-profit organizations that are faith focused and ministry minded, trying to advance the kingdom. So when you're working with that insurer, at the end of the day, you can be confident that you have good insurance, right? Or at least the best that you can afford, talking about stewardship. And that confidence really is going to fuel creativity. And so, when the leader knows that the ministry is supported and prepared, man, they're probably going to be more likely to launch that new program, open up the door some more, serve their communities in ways they hadn't thought for. Because, beyond just having that insurance policy, they can know that at least with Lightwell, right, they have this advisor that speaks into the operations of the ministry and provide the necessary resources to enhance the ministry. So again, not to over spiritualize here, but I really do believe that in that sense, insurance and having the right team behind that with your organization becomes a kind of behind the scenes enabler of gospel work.
I totally agree. Now, I mean, I'm the choir and you're preaching to the choir, but I
Yes.
totally agree. I think
Yes. I need
it
some
is
amens
just
here, Adam.
one
Yeah.
tool. Yes, yes, and amen. It's just one tool in the tool belt of wise ministry leadership. And so from your vantage point, you get the chance to work across the country with all of our Lightwell Insurance Advisor agencies, and you get to see a lot from where you sit. And as you look at that, your role now, um, we've been asking this question to every guest who comes on the podcast lately. What inspires you to keep going? We talk about Lightwell being, this visual metaphor, this image of light shining through into places that might otherwise remain dark and unventilated. That is what a Lightwell is. And so as you see our agencies and advisors doing that, what inspires you to keep going, to keep shining that light?
I don't work directly with the churches anymore, at least. And to a degree, that makes me a little bit sad because I feel like I'm kind of like removed from the front line. But what I do get to do, and I really do mean this, is step into a different ministry of kind of like empowering the empowerers, if that makes sense. So, it's really, really meaningful to me to, look at the agencies that we have across the nation and all of the individuals that make up those agencies, all of the people. And for me, it's a ministry of discipleship and knowing how to or figuring out how to help this individual and ultimately this organization step deeper into God's leading in their lives so that we can help the church and the Christian nonprofit and the school and the camp and the whatever else is out there. For me, I mean, that is so cool to be a part of. And what's really really fun in that is uh I got to kind of live out like, okay, hear what I'm about to say because I feel like an absolute, I don't know how I feel about this. I just don't like it, but I'm going to say it anyways, okay? Paul in his letters in his epistles to the church, right? He's always showing these logistical, financial, kind of organizational plannings alongside radical faith. And I feel like I kind of get to sit in that seat a little bit where, I can think through the logistical, the financial, the organizational, like all of this planning stuff, but also be having a lot of fun with the radical faith side and kind of dream about, oh man, God, what could you do with this? And I'll say this to you, and I'll say this to anybody else that's listening. Um, I would really encourage you, and this is for our Lightwell partners. So this is for the folks that we work with, that we don't work with. I don't really care, right? If you're in a ministry setting and you really want to kind of look into the future, be careful in your stewardship, which we've already talked about, right? Be prayerful in your decision making, but man, be audaciously visionary. Because if you have that audacious vision that is, prayerfully decided upon by leadership, and then it's carefully stewarded to execution, man, you are off to the races. And boldness becomes sustainable and rewarding. It's not risky anymore. And we can see just how much God can do because we're not trying to limit him just into what we think he can do. It's just so cool to me. And that's so inspiring to see when that does happen, and how, be it a person or an organization, takes off some of those blinders and they feel supported and they step into that and they see God's hand moving. Oh my goodness. That is the most fulfilling, meaningful, incredible, privileged position that I could possibly be in, and I love it.
Matt Gumbert, the Lightwell Insurance Advisor, National Director of Operations and Network Collaboration. You have been a delight to talk to today. Thank you so much for your perspective, the way that your background helps shape your perspective, and what you're doing now helps empower those who are out there serving ministries and helping them feel courageous and bold and more um, engaged in the calling to which they have been called. Matt, thank you so much for your time today.
Hey, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure, and I hope we get to chat soon. Adam, let's do this again.
My thanks once again to Matt Gumbert. What a great conversation. That was very encouraging to me. Hopefully, if you're a ministry leader out there listening today, that was an encouragement to you. And maybe that raised some questions about whether or not you have everything you need to take care of your ministry. And if it did, I encourage you to go to lightwell.com and find an advisor in your area who can ask those questions that illuminate needs that really only ministries face and other organizations don't. And that would be my hope for you today. And so until the next episode of the podcast, go and let it shine.